Hello, this is Eric Lee with Equity Real Estate, giving you a training on the brand new purchase contract that was released by the Division of Real Estate for agents in Utah just the last couple of days. So this is all brand new and not a lot of changes. If you actually dive into the contract, here we are at the start of it. You don't see any differences. In fact, you don't see differences until you get down here to section 4. And then what we see is this real estate brokerage compensation. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out to you here is that, first of all, this is a form created by the Division of Real Estate. It's not a UAR form. This is a statewide form for all real estate agents to use with residential real estate. And so we need to be using it. We need to be using the most current version. So if you've got an outdated version saved on your desktop somewhere, stop using that. Here in Utah at Equity, we've already got this uploaded to .loop if you need it there, or I'm pulling it up here on the MLS. All right. So let's look at this really quickly, and then we're going to have a discussion on how to use this. I just did this training today with my agents, and it went nearly 2 hours, but we had a really good discussion. I don't want to make this video that long, but I do want to have a discussion with you guys because I see so much confusion and back and forth and a little bit, honestly, infighting amongst realtors that we see on some of the social media groups that we all belong to. So first of all, we're going to be looking down at 4.3E, the real estate brokerage compensation. Seller and buyer agree that the seller shall contribute, and I get to pick one, not both. It's an or, not an and or, okay? And it's either going to be a percent of the purchase price or a flat dollar amount, okay? That the buyer and seller agree shall contribute blank of the purchase price to the buyer's brokerage, and that would be the seller's compensation contribution, okay? If no box is checked, then the seller has not agreed to compensate the buyer's brokerage and the REPSI. So if you leave this blank, there is no offer of compensation from the seller to the buyer's brokerage. This payment shall be made in addition to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage. Now, folks, in fact, let me just read through the whole thing really quick, and then let's talk about how this plays out. If applicable, buyer agrees that the seller's compensation contribution combined with any other payment from the seller's brokerage, if applicable to buyer's brokerage, shall not exceed the amount agreed to between the buyer and the buyer's brokerage in their written buyer-broker agreement. These provisions survive closing. And then down here in F, we see another little change that we authorize and direct the title company, the escrow closing office, to withhold from seller's proceeds at closing. And we've got a lot of things that they're, paying off: mortgages, trustees, judgments, mechanics, liens, and the real estate brokerage compensation. And this survives closing. Okay. Now let's talk really quickly about how this plays out. One of the mistakes that I'm seeing agents make is if they're not educated, then they're thinking, you know what, let's just get everything signed just to be safe. That doesn't make you safe. Okay. And I want to really stress that here. For example, let's say that we have an offer of compensation agreement signed, and that form would be the real estate brokerage compensation agreement right here, right? Let's say that we've already got this signed between us and the listing brokerage, where the buyer's brokerage, listing brokerage has said, yes, we'll pay you guys 3%, right? Okay, we've got it negotiated in there. We'll pay you guys 3%. We've got it down here. It's signed by the agent and the broker. And so then we come back here, and when we're writing our offer in the real estate purchase contract, let's jump back to that form and jump back down to section 4. We say, you know what, just to be safe, let's put in here that we get paid 3%. Let's just reiterate that. This isn't making you safe. Okay, this payment is made in addition to any other compensation agreed to. And so you've already agreed to 3% in your brokerage compensation agreement. So now you're committed to 6%. And granted, there's the caveat down here that you can't pay out more than what the buyer agent has agreed to in their buyer agency agreement. But still, I've got agents that are putting 4% in their buyer agency agreement. So if there's 3 here and there's 3 on the broker's compensation agreement form, sorry, what's the actual name of it? Yeah, the real estate broker's compensation agreement. if I've got 3 there and 3 here, I could collect as much as 4% if I put 4% in my buyer agency agreement. So let's talk about how this really plays out for you guys when you're writing offers. Okay. There is one scenario where if I'm the buyer's agent and I call up the listing agent and I say, listing agent, how much we want to write an offer, and the listing agent just magically happens to answer their phone. Okay. Which doesn't happen every time, right? We're writing up an offer right now and we're wondering, is there any compensation amount offered that the seller is offering? And the listing agent says, yes, they're offering 3%. And I say, okay, fantastic. Could I get the brokerage compensation agreement signed for that amount? And he says, yep, we've got it right here. The sellers have already signed it. I'll send it over to you. I sign it. That gives me that 3%. And we're imagining here that I've already met with my buyers and we've agreed to a 3% offering. And granted, when I say 3%, this is just a scenario. It's all negotiable. You guys all know it's negotiable. You can do any amount that you want to, provided at least at equity that we cover our minimum fees. Okay. So we have this conversation. Listing agent says, yes, we're offering 3. We get the brokerage compensation agreement signed. And then I send over my offer and I would put 0 here. Okay. Because I already have a compensation agreement in place. This is in addition to any other compensation agreement. Now, since my buyer agency agreement says I can only get paid 3%, there's no sense asking for more here. All right. But let me talk to you about more of a realistic scenario. All right. We've got a couple of different scenarios. Let's say that the listing agent is offering, or the seller rather, is offering a 3%. Okay. They're authorizing their agent to communicate 3%. Okay. That's what section 2.2 now of the listing agreement says. It's not an obligation for them to pay you. That is simply them allowing the listing agent to communicate that they're willing to pay up to that amount. Okay. So let's say that they're offering 3% or willing to pay that 3%. And I call ahead and they say, yep, we're willing to pay that 3%. Do I need to get the brokerage compensation agreement signed up front? The answer is no. Because even if they told me they're willing to pay 3%, right? And here we're going to jump to another form. Let's jump to the listing agreement. Okay. Right here it says, let's say that as a listing agent, I'm getting 2.5 and the company is authorized to communicate up to 3% that they'll offer. And then we got to jump down to 2.3 to see how this actually works. In the event the company agrees in a written compensation agreement to pay a buyer's brokerage, right? So that's saying right here, if the company agrees to, in this real estate brokerage compensation agreement, if they agree to this 3% that the seller allowed me to offer to a buyer's agent, then the seller agrees that that amount, that 3%, will be added to the brokerage fee up here, which would then be 5.5%, right? And we can't agree to a written compensation agreement that exceeds the amount authorized in section 2.2. All right. So if somebody called me up, if a buyer's agent called me up and says, what are you offering? And let's say that I had 2% in here. Well, I can't, as a brokerage, automatically go to this brokerage compensation agreement and come to any other amount than 2%. I can't go higher than that because this section 2.3 says I can't. All right. I could do a brokerage compensation agreement up to 2%. But I want to teach you guys, if one of my agents said, it feels like I'm doing mental gymnastics. So I want to simplify it for you with this new purchase contract. Okay. If I am the buyer's agent making an offer, I don't care what the listing agent is allowed to communicate to me, right? Let me reiterate. Doesn't matter what they're allowed to communicate to me. I still have to get it in writing, whether that's sending over the brokerage commission or the brokerage compensation agreement in advance and getting that signed. And let me just state really clearly here that if you do use the brokerage compensation agreement, it is a separate agreement from the purchase contract. This is not the addendum. This is not the brokerage payment addendum, which, by the way, becomes almost completely irrelevant now that we have the language built into the purchase contract itself. It's almost the exact same language as the brokerage payment addendum. So if I were to use the brokerage compensation agreement, it would have to be that I get this agreement signed in place before I submit my offer, because this is not a part of my offer. And it is conceivable that if I sent them over both together concurrently, that the seller could accept my offer, but not have the brokerage sign my compensation agreement. And then I put 0 in here in anticipation that they would sign, but they didn't sign. And now I have no way to get compensated by the seller. All right. Granted, I could try to negotiate it later in an addendum or something like that. And that's where I would use the broker's payment addendum and try to come in and fix my mistake. But I'm going to avoid the brokerage compensation agreement altogether. I'm going to try to avoid the broker's payment addendum because that's really only if I made a mistake here. And I'm going to simplify it and just keep it all in my purchase contract. So when I'm writing an offer, I call the other agent, and guess what I don't talk about? I don't talk about how much they're offering in compensation. I say, what kind of terms would your seller like? Do they need extra time to move out? Do they need, for possession or whatever? Those types of things. Is the home going to clear for FHA inspections and stuff? I might still want to have all of those conversations, but I'm not going to discuss my compensation at all, because I've already had that conversation as a buyer's agent with my buyers. They know how much I'm worth. We've got an agreement that says I'm worth, let's say 3% or 2.5% or whatever, right? Maybe it's 4%. So if I've got a buyer agency agreement with my buyers that I'm worth 4%, then I'm just going to come in here and put 4%. I'm going to write up my offer, put 4% or 3% or whatever you have in your buyer agency agreement, and I'm going to send that off. And the listing agent might call me up and say, hey, sorry, I should have communicated this to you before, but the sellers are only allowing me to communicate up to 2.5% or whatever, right? And I say, that's okay. You've got our offer. Please present that to your clients, right? Doesn't matter what they're offering. It doesn't matter what they're communicating. I've got to get it in writing. Here it is, built right into the purchase contract. Just put it there. Don't call and ask. Put how much you've negotiated in your buyer agency agreement right here and put it in your offer. Okay? And then that puts the burden on the seller to have this discussion with their agent saying, hey, we really didn't want to offer 4%. We wanted to offer 2%, but this is a pretty good offer. Our home's been on the market for 5 or 6 months. Or it could be, hey, they're asking for 4%. We've got the identical offer from somebody else here that's only asking for 3%. Maybe we should do a best and final. Maybe we should see if they're willing to come down on that a little bit. That's up to the discussion between the seller and their agent. Okay. I let them have that discussion. That's part of the negotiation strategy that we're employing here, because otherwise we might leave money on the table. If I call ahead and they say, hey, we're willing to offer 2%, or we're not offering anything, or it depends on how good your offer is, how much of a compensation we'll offer. All of those things are allowable, right? The listing agent could have had that discussion with their seller, and the seller says, depends on how much, how good the offer is on how much we want to offer as compensation. And so that's all you're allowed to communicate is, hey, bring us your offer and we'll see. So let's flip this now and say that you're the listing agent, right? And somebody calls you up and says, hey, is there an offer of compensation from the seller? My advice to you guys is to say, send us your offer with your commission in there, and we'll see what we can do with, right? Because if I say, yes, we're offering 3%, what if that buyer agent had in his buyer agency agreement said, I'd like 3%, but I'm willing to work for 2? Now, if I tell that buyer, hey, bring us an offer and we'll review it and see how much we want to negotiate for compensation, that's all negotiable, then that places the burden now on the buyer and their agent to communicate with each other and say how much my service is worth. And really, quite frankly, that's the essence of this settlement agreement, is that it should all be negotiable. It should all be right up front there. And what I want to avoid is, and see, we all have this dream scenario that I see kicked back and forth online where um, seller's agents say, yes, we're offering 3%. And we're finding all these sneaky ways to do it. We're going to put it in the showing agreement or the showing instructions, which you can't do. We're going to put it on the lockbox. All these dumb things. Guys, cut through all of that. None of that needs to be in place. Don't worry about it all. Let me give you a scenario. Let's say your asking price is $500,000 on a home. You go down to the agent remarks and say, you're the listing agent, right? You've said, we're asking for 500,000. Do you go down to the remarks and say, we would love to get an offer of 500,000, but we're willing to go as low as 490? No, you might as well change your asking price to 490, right? Everybody's going to be offering only 490. So in that same vein of thought, why should I go to a buyer's agent and say, yes, we're offering 3%? Why don't I wait and see what they come to me with? Because they might come to me with 2%. When that buyer and the buyer's agent have that discussion, so we really love this house. Remember when we met, you said you would do it for 3%, but possibly you would go as low as 2%. Will you go as low as 2% on this? See, now as a seller, if as a listing agent, if I don't communicate to the buyer's agent how much we're willing to offer, that burden is now on the buyer's agent. And I'm much more likely to get better terms, than if I had said right up front, yeah, we're offering 3%. Okay. I hope that makes sense to you guys. But what it does is it means it doesn't matter if they're offering 2.5. It doesn't matter if they're offering 2. It doesn't matter if they're offering 0. As a buyer's agent, I don't care. I've got my buyer agency agreement that says I make 3% or 2.5%, whatever it is you've agreed to. And that number goes in here. So if I've said in my buyer agency agreement, 2%, then 2% goes right there. I submit my offer. And if they said, hey, we're not offering anything, say, well, my offer is contingent on this. So consider that now in your offering, right? This is a part of our offer. So as buyer's agents, we don't care if their answer is, if we're asking the listing agent and they say, depends on how good your offer is, how much we're offering. So my advice to you is, as a buyer's agent, don't even ask. Okay. It doesn't matter what they're willing to offer. You have to get it in writing. So don't ask at all. Just put it in writing. This is what my buyer agency commission is. Here it is. It's 3%, it's 4%, whatever. Put that in your offer and send it over. As a listing agent, if somebody calls and says, how much are you offering? My advice is to say, we've had that discussion with my seller, and it all depends on what the offer is. So send over the offer. I'm not authorized to communicate any number to you because it all depends, right? And then that puts the burden on them. And there's a very good chance that those numbers will come back in your favor. I hope this has been helpful to you. The other nice thing about this is that, some people are like, well, people ask, who's going to police these things? Like, for example, that you can't get paid, the buyer agent can't get paid more than what they've got in their buyer broker agreement that's in writing. Well, right here, we authorize title. So maybe it will play out that way. Maybe it will, we're authorizing title to withhold from seller's proceeds, the compensation agreement. And since this says it can't be more than that, maybe title will be asking for a copy of that to prove that. We'll see how that plays out in the future, but we will be policing it from within equity. We cannot receive more than what you put in your buyer agency agreement. So if you put 1% in your buyer agency agreement And even if they were offering 3, we can't accept 3. You can't add an addendum going up to 3. You put 1, we're capped at 1. Okay. So I would recommend start high. You can always negotiate down if you want to, but I would start high and work your way down if that's your business plan. But you can't start low and then work your way up. It just part of the settlement agreement doesn't allow for that. So hopefully that makes sense to you. That's substantially the only change. It's this little section right here. Everything else in the purchase contract is effectively the same. So there is your overview of the new contract, as well as kind of an in-depth discussion on how to utilize it in the real world of making offers, both from the buyer's perspective and receiving offers from the seller's perspective. I hope that was helpful.